This is a book that I wish that I had kind of read pre-COVID as well as post-COVID, because I think it would have given me a completely different point of view. But here we are. Hi, welcome back to my channel. For February, no, what month is it? For March. For March, I decided to go for my new genre, to go for a classic. So the book I chose was The Plague by Albert Camus. This book tells the story of a city on the coast of North Africa that gets riddled with a pestilence, a plague, that they have to shut down the borders, keep everyone quarantined. Lots of people die. Lots of people suffer through it. It doesn't sound like a lot happens because of the nature of a quarantine and lack of action. But really, it's a book that explores the concepts, I think, of the human condition when humanity is forced to come together against a greater common enemy. I mean, Camus says it himself that this story is one of love, of exile, and of suffering. And those are kind of the three major plot points that keep coming up throughout. It's a book that I actually had picked up during COVID. As an audience in 2026, we have a completely different point of view of what this book means than when it was written in, I think, the 40s or the 50s. This book, for context, is one that a lot of people theorize or analyze as being a metaphor for fascism, for the Nazi regime, especially in France, and Camus' own interactions with politics and what politics were looking like at the time in World War II. So we have a lot of instances of words and phrases being used as if the plague itself was an army, or as if the plague itself was some kind of executioner or military warden or prisoner warden. And all of it kind of comes together in this overarching idea of incarceration and exile and the suffering that humans go through, but also the love that can be found in those times of terror. The setting of the book, like I said, is on this coastal town called Oran in North Africa. It starts out with a plague, kind of like any other sickness. Couple of animals get sick, no one really pays attention. Couple of people get sick, no one really pays attention. It's a big city. People are going to get sick. People are going to die. People are going to die of the same thing. And it doesn't really become apparent that anything's wrong until about a third of the way into the book. The book is kind of divided into these 5 distinct parts. The first part is kind of setting the scene, the descriptions. Camus writes that everyone is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. It's a treeless, glamourless, soulless. The town of Oran ends by seeming restful, and after a while you go complacently to sleep there. No, all these horrors were not near enough as yet even to ruffle the equanimity of that spring afternoon. These beautiful descriptions of nature and also of the setting immediately puts us into a town that is boring, a soulless, glamourless. The extraordinary doesn't normally happen to. That's what the first part kind of sets up. The second part begins with the town realizing that plague is a possibility and shutting the borders. And immediately, to me, I was thrown back to 2020 when that day in March, surprisingly enough, that everything was just completely shut down. And it seemed like it came out of nowhere, and no one really knew what to do about it because we were hearing about this thing that not a lot of us were in interactions with yet, and no one knew what to expect. And that's the vibe that part 2 kind of explores, is this confusion, this need to understand what's happening, where we're going, what's going to be done, who's going to save them, if this is even something they need to be worrying about. Part 3 goes into this sort of anger phase of it all. The anger, the rebellion, people are unhappy, people are starting to die in large quantities, people are scared, they really just want to get out of there. Part 4 goes into almost this resignation, acceptance part of grief, where people are just so used to death that it doesn't even faze them anymore, that they're so used to their neighbors dying and to their suffering and to their separation from their loved ones, they can't even feel the joy of life anymore. They have resigned themselves. And then part 5 ultimately is the resolution of when the plague begins to peter out and life comes back fully. So it attaches this sort of life cycle to the plague that somewhat follows the life cycle of grief and of suffering that we as humans go through. And I think it's beautiful to see it written in a group think sort of way. I think I should start by saying that it's narrated by an unbiased narrator. And I put that in quotations because the narrator is constantly telling us that they are unbiased and that they don't want to have an opinion on this, but then they constantly have an opinion on everything. So a lot of this is written by the quote unquote narrator who is aiming to tell the story as unbiased as possible. And because of that, a lot of the general sentiments, while they are specific to people in the town, also relate to on a general level to so many people in that town. So some of the characters that we end up meeting, I would say the first and probably primary character that we meet is Dr. Bernard Rieux. He is the main doctor whose point of view we get. He's not the only doctor in town, but he is a well-respected one who the officials will listen to. He's kind of the first one that says, even if this isn't plague, we need to start taking precautions as if it is, because if we don't and it is plague, we will only regret not taking precautions. If it's not and we took precautions, we won't regret people not dying, if that makes sense. And there's this question about throughout the story if Dr. Rieux, I don't speak French, so it might be Rieux or Rieux. I'm just going to call him Rieux. If Dr. Rieux is a hero or if he's just someone doing his job. Other people in town tend to treat him like a hero. Even the descriptions of characters in how they speak about him, it's all very heroic because they think him taking care of the sick and putting himself on the front lines every day is very heroic. But Dr. Rieux is constantly asserting that he is just doing his job, that there is no question of heroism in this. It's a matter of common decency. And he also says, heroism and sanctity don't really appeal to me. What interests me is being a man. And I think this also goes into this idea of in times of trouble or strife, for example, World War II or COVID, it's often the ordinary people who are lauded as heroes and as greater than man because they are taking on this noble effort and putting themselves at risk in order to fight the good fight. But at the end of the day, what is a hero really? Are we all not capable of heroism? And are we all not capable of helping our fellow man and doing the acts that we claim are heroic? Is that not within us all and our responsibility to each other to take care of each other? There's a lot of this conversation, especially around Dr. Rieux. He's also kind of seen as a character who maybe is not boring, but like other people tend to think that he doesn't care as much because he's a doctor, he's practical, he divorces his feelings from his job. People say like, you use the language of reason, not the heart. You live in a world of abstractions. But I think it's all just to say like he sees things as they are. And there's even a quote like, he sees them in the garish light of justice, hideous, witless justice. Things to him are not romanticized. He sees life and death, and he sees a fellow man in the patients that he's treating. So that's all I really want to get into with Dr. Rieux for now. Then we have Jean Theroux. Again, I don't speak French, so could be wrong. And he is sort of the character that acts as the philosopher. He is on man's search for meaning. So he, throughout the book, is described as writing these really plentiful diary entries throughout the plague because he wants to record for history every little detail that's going on. And it starts out that he's noting everything he sees. As the time goes on, fewer and fewer things catch his curiosity or seem notable, and his curiosities turn a little bit more inward. And throughout this, he is always on the search for meaning. His descriptions of the mundane actually make the life in Oran seem interesting. He describes the nature, he describes people walking down the street and shopping. He describes his neighbor who stands on his balcony and calls for the cats to come out so that he can spit on them and throw a piece of paper on them. All these little details that contradict exactly what the narrator is saying about life being so boring and lifeless. Instead, Rieux is finding the meaning in every little aspect of life. He also has a large part of kind of being this saint without a god. He brings up the conversation of faith a lot. And in Man's Search for Meaning, what role does faith have? He's very anti death penalty. It seems to be he tends to be a little bit more liberal-minded and fighting the justice for the people. And he describes people who can't or don't want to help other people as people who are plague-stricken. So already we're getting this direct correlation between plague, physical ailment, and plague, social ideology. And he says, I only know that one must do what one can to cease being plague-stricken. And that's the only way in which we can hope for some peace, or failing that, a decent death. We must keep an endless watch on ourselves, lest in a careless moment we breathe in somebody's face and fasten the infection on him. The good man is the man who has the fewest lapses of attention, and it needs tremendous willpower, a never-ending tension of the mind to avoid such lapses. Some of us, those who want to get the plague out of their systems, feel such desperate weariness from which nothing remains to set us free except death. This perfectly kind of describes, especially in our modern context, outside of the context of World War II, but in the context of plague and social outcry, the ideas that especially were becoming prevalent in times of COVID with the murder of George Floyd and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. It doesn't seem coincidental to me that social reform is also coming at the same time as physical ailment and seclusion. And I think Camus was somehow able to kind of capture that in this book from 70-ish years ago, this idea that a plague festers in all of us, and we need to pay attention to the things we're saying and the things we're thinking to constantly reevaluate how much we are being affected by selfishness or by hatred or by injustice. And it's tiring and it's exhausting, and a lot of times people don't want to do the work, and that's why we do have people who are hateful and rude and awful and selfish, because they don't want to do the work it takes to constantly evaluate yourself and your part in all of that. And he even says the only thing that can set you free at that point is death. And that kind of scares him, because he at this point is pondering his role in past injustices and how in the future he can be rid of his internal plague if the only real way out for peace is death. His main thesis is, it is our job as people to not join forces with the pestilences. And I think that is such a powerful line, because it's, we as humanity have to fight the good fight, especially in the context of World War II. Very bold statement for him to be making with the rise of Nazism. It is our job as people to not join the side of pestilences. Then there is a journalist called Raymond Rambert. And his arc throughout this story is one of personal happiness versus collective action. So his whole thing is that he came to Iran to write as a journalist, got stuck in the lockdown, hasn't been able to leave to go home. He sees himself as a pretty privileged man. He tries to go to the city to ask about exceptions. They tell him there are no exceptions. He says there must be some exceptions. And they said, well, if we make an exception for you, we're going to have to make an exception for everybody. So already the plague is acting as this kind of equalizer of status, of race, of gender, of nationality. Plague doesn't care about any of that. You have to stay here. And he spends the entire book trying to find ways illegally to bypass the lockdown and to get back to his wife. In the end, though, when he finally has his chances at freedom after many, many failed attempts at escaping, he finally has his way out. And he turns around and he decides to go to the hospital to help Dr. Rieux, because he says, it may be shameful to be happy by oneself. I know that I belong here whether I want it or not. This business is everybody's business. So his character takes the dramatic 180 arc of personal happiness versus collective well-being. Then we have some smaller characters. We have Joseph Grand, who spends the entire book saying he's going to write a book, and he only gets to the first sentence. And every time he wants someone to edit his sentence, he just wants to change one word, or he's really stuck on one word, or he's really stuck on like one aspect of the phrase that doesn't sound right to him. And he's saying he's never getting it right. And he can't continue writing until he gets his first sentence right. So everything is surrounded around his one sentence. And why do we care about it? I don't think we necessarily do, but I think it is a picture into the futility of inaction and of kind of like of nitpicking certain things rather than taking a grand scope of the actual project or problem, which in this case is plague. So I think it's a reflection of if we only care about one person versus the entirety of the town, are we actually going to get anywhere? Then we have Cotard. He is someone who is afraid of the police coming to arrest him for something that he did. And he seems to be thriving in the plague times, which no one else is. So he's a really interesting character because he seems to really like being in lockdown. He really likes that everyone else is miserable. And he really likes that no one seems to care about his criminal past because everyone is equal under the plague. And he actually thrives from people being forced to be miserable and people being forced to feel what he describes as himself feeling internally for decades. And there's a quote like, he would rather be one of the beleaguered crowd than a prisoner alone. That's really all there is to say about him. And lastly, we have Father Panelot, who is the preacher in town. And he takes an arc from, we see two of his sermons in detail from the narrator's point of view. The first sermon is this sort of fire and brimstone. God sends the plague as a way to punish people who don't believe. If you believe, he won't punish you. The plagues were sent in the Bible and they were always to wash away the sinners, etc., etc., etc. He then, towards the end of the book, witnesses in excruciating detail the death of a child when they're trying to find a cure. And this is something that, again, the narrator is describing quite explicitly. And it is hard to read. It's hard to read pages and pages of a child screaming in agony, the coughs, the blood coming up, the shaking, the tremors. It's horrible. It's horrible to read. And Father Panelot has a sort of come to God moment where he begins questioning his faith and questioning all of it. Why would God let this child suffer? He begins on this spiral and he gives a second sermon where he says, we must believe in divine goodness. Believe everything, give in to God. There is no island of escape in time of plague. We must accept the dilemma and choose either to hate God or to love God, to trust in divine goodness and not to seek personal respite. So it seems that his fire and brimstone took him to, I don't know why this is happening, but we can either choose to accept that it's happening and love God or hate him for it. And he chooses to love God. There was descriptions of doubt and faith throughout the entire book, but he's one of the characters who seems to hold steady to his faith, even though his relationship with faith changed. And in the end, his faith didn't save him. He dies of suspected plague. He declines medical care, although by this point, Dr. Rieux and him, even though they don't agree on God and science, Rieux sees him as a sort of friend. And the priest just says priests can have no friends. They've given their all to God in a resigned sort of manner, and he turns over and dies. And the irony is that his death was listed as plague doubtful. So in the end, he died from something that might not even be the plague. I don't know what it means necessarily, but there's that. And so again, going to some of these themes. So let's go back to that one we were just talking about. So faith and doubt. A plague, something like a pestilence or like COVID-19, shows that death doesn't have favoritism. Death will come for us all. And microbes and germs and bacteria and viruses, they don't care about who you are. Not to quote Hamilton. But death doesn't discriminate between anyone. Again, we see the death of the child that causes a lot of people to question their faith in God because they finally had a cure that they thought was going to work. And in using this child, there was so much hope written into the narration that ultimately ended in death. It made me as a reader feel like I was taken on that journey of faith in God, and then to have it not work is that moment of doubt. In one of their last conversations, Dr. Rieux says to Father Panelot, he says, "No, Father, I have a very different idea of love and until my dying day I shall refuse to love a scheme of things in which children are put to torture. So again, all of this is coming back to, I think, especially post-World War II, this rise in sort of anti-Christianity, anti-religion, because such awful things are happening. How can it be for the greater good is kind of what I feel like Camus is exploring here. Then we go back again to that idea of fascism and incarceration and the language that's used a lot. So I'm just going to read some quotes that stuck out to me, especially in conversation of incarceration and prison, especially because Rieux talks so heavily about being anti-death penalty and about the prison system and incarceration system. So they fancied themselves free, and no one will ever be free so long as there are pestilences. They came to know the incorrigible sorrow of all prisoners and exiles, which is to live in company with a memory that serves no purpose. The sermon simply brought home the fact that they had been sentenced for an unknown crime to an indeterminate period of punishment. The plague was no respecter of persons, and under its despotic rule, everyone was under sentence, and perhaps for the first time, impartial justice reigned in the prison. So again, there's this vivid image of the prison and plague being this grip on this town, and they are all prisoners under it, which then goes into the idea of plague and disaster being an equalizer of everyone. So at the beginning, even those who don't have the plague can't stop thinking about it. So everyone is affected by it. We see the tides sort of swing in the opposite direction where disparities are getting bigger. You know, like the rich are spending more to feel better. The poor are getting poorer. But still, plague doesn't care about that. Plague is going to kill who the plague comes in contact with. There's the part where once they start losing hope, the general population, they're no longer having individual destinies. They have a collective destiny made of plague and the emotions. They had ceased to choose for themselves. Plague had leveled out discrimination. But what's really interesting is that Camus comes back to this idea and how after living with plague for so long, this kind of equalizer, the system of discrimination sets back in. The poor fight to live while the rich have more than enough. You would think a leveling out would be the neutrality of humanity, but it seems inherently we have personal interest, or we have like Darwinism of survival of the fittest, where once things are even out, certain people will continue to rise and others will continue to fall. And it felt very true during COVID too, where it was like all of us were being affected by this. But at a certain point, it then became a thing of rich people could afford the healthcare that they needed to get out of there. They didn't care about the lockdown. They ignored lockdown because they didn't think it applied to them. While people in conditions with poor sanitation, or people in conditions where they're forced to be around a lot of people or forced to work for money to live, those were the people who were being affected the most by something that inherently does not discriminate. But our society is creating the discrimination. Anyway, and then finally, like this idea of solitude, exile, and human connection. What is at the heart of all of it? I think first, the idea of love is described pretty greatly, especially in the beginning of the plague. The narrator goes on about people being separated from their loved ones, either in quarantine, where one family member's sick, being separated by death, being separated by the physical lockdown, the wall in the city, all of these separations and how it's affecting everybody, and how a feeling normally as an individual as the ache of separation from those one loves suddenly becomes a feeling in which all shared alike. And along with fear, the greatest affliction of the long period of exile that lay ahead. Everyone was feeling this, and it's such an individual feeling, but there's also something comforting in knowing that everyone is feeling this. Obviously, the theme of exile goes again into that idea of incarceration. So I don't know if I need to explore that any further, but this idea also of longing for human connection, but not being able to get it. We saw this a lot in COVID, where people just so badly wanted to be together, but physically, for the sake of the only way to fight the plague is to not be in human connection. And what does that mean? And then we think about like humanity as a whole. So they create these sanitary squads where people are volunteering to take away the dead bodies and burn them, or to clean up the hospital rooms, or to create hospital rooms, things that need to be done in order to try and keep the plague at bay. It's, again, going back to that idea of heroism, but when men risk their lives on the sanitary squad, it's not a question of risk or reward, but simply doing it. There's nothing admirable about this attitude. It was merely logical. And I think that's a plus of humanity, that at a certain point, like we saw a lot of frontline workers during COVID, or people in the front lines during war, it's not a matter of risk and reward. You just do it because that's all there is to do. That is the fight that's in front of you, and you either do it or you don't. It's not, well, it's a little bit risky, I don't know if I'm going to do it, or the reward's not that high. You just have to do it. And Rieux and see, I'm definitely not saying this right. Rieux and Rieux start becoming friends. And the first time they have like a friendship talk, the narrator describes Rieux as seeing the same glimpse on his friend's face of the same happiness, a happiness that forgot nothing, not even murder. So this ache of human connection and friendship that forms even in the darkest of times. The whole town lived as if it had no future. So again, this solitude, this exile, this need for human connection. There's even a quote, "A loveless world is a dead world, and always there comes an hour when one is weary of prisons." That's sort of in the description of when people start rebelling to get out of the wall because they can't seem to live without their love. And I think that's so important, and people get so tired of being alone, and no matter how much they say that that's what they want or that's what they need, they can't stay alone. And towards the end, there is a quote that's when the plague starts receding. The quote says, "It could be said that once the faintest stirring of hope became possible, the dominion of the plague was ended." And I think that's a beautiful ending to describing not only physical war, but this war on disease, that once we begin to hope as a society, as a collective, if we can spread that hope, the plague no longer has the power to overtake people. And I think that's what Rieux gets at with people being plague-stricken in the mind. Now we're going to get into a little bit of spoilers. So you can finish here if you don't want to be spoiled the ending. But there's also, with love is loss. And I think one of the greatest ironies in the book is the last bit where the plague is finally receding and people are celebrating and being joyous and life is worth living again. And the sun comes out and people are smiling and dancing and celebrating. But there are still the families who have lost people. And there are still people getting sick and dying. And death does not just go away because the plague is receding. More than one character dies at this point in the book. And I think Camus intentionally put those deaths at the end as a stark reminder that life, one, is cyclical, and two, doesn't have a happy ending for everybody, or doesn't end in a neatly tied bow, I would say. Rieux does contract the plague just as the plague begins to settle in town. And that is Dr. Rieux's greatest suffering in all of this. He has seen thousands and thousands of people die under his care, but this is the death that gets him. And he says, "The town set free at last made Rieux cruelly aware that this defeat was final, the last disastrous battle that ends a war and makes peace itself an ill beyond all remedy." The doctor could not tell if Rieux had found peace now that all was over, but for himself he had a feeling that no peace was possible to him henceforth, any more than there can be an armistice for a mother bereaved of her son or for a man who buries his friend. Rieux had died that evening before their friendship had even gotten the chance to fully flourish outside of all that they knew. And I think, especially in the context of war, this is something that a lot of people had to go through, where they met some of the greatest people of their lives in these terrible situations, and the terrible situations took them away long before they could have what we think of as a normal life or a normal relationship or normal friendship. And that brings us to Dr. Rieux is the narrator. I kind of got this feeling towards about like 2/3 of the way through the book because, well, one, we were seeing everything through mostly Dr. Rieux's eyes, but the irony of the narrator wanting everything to be objective, but keeps inserting his opinion about certain things. And one of those certain things being the character of Rieux and how noble he was and how such of a good person he was. And I was like, there's only one person in this book who I think would raise Rieux that highly, and also who would have access to all of his items in order to tell this tale, if that makes sense. All of this to say that the irony of this narration of Dr. Rieux, again, just wanting to do his job, but then he unintentionally turns the story of heroism onto his friend and not to his own work. And I think it just goes into the whole theme of love and suffering and the human condition that they were all experiencing in this time. And then I just want to end with like some of my favorite quotes from the ending, because I think I can't say them better than Camus, so I might as well just read them out. This is when, after Tarot dies, but what had he won? No more than the experience of having known plague and remembering it, of having known friendship and remembering it, of knowing affection and being destined one day to remember it. So all a man could win in the conflict between plague and life was knowledge and memories. And then we get into how the town sort of starts to change. They denied that we had ever been that hag-ridden populace, a part of which was daily fed into a furnace and went up in oily fumes, while the rest, in shackled impotence, waited for their return. That, again, immediately strikes to me in my modern context, post-COVID. People immediately wanted to forget it ever happened, that we were ever doing 6 feet apart separation, that we were ever wearing masks, leaving our groceries out in the garage 24 hours so that they would kill the germs. We were doing such crazy things, and people, they don't want to remember the death and they don't want to remember the suffering. And I think this description of part of this populace fed into a furnace daily, that is such a vivid picture of people dying. And again, in the context of World War II, the gas chambers, I don't think that that's an image not put purposefully there. No one wants to think about the horrors of it all. They want to forget it ever happened, and they want to move on with their life because they survived. Meanwhile, if we forget, that's when we return exactly to where we were when it all started. Wanting to just get back to how it was before. It was to this, their lost home, towards happiness they longed to return, turning their backs disgustedly on all else. And in the end, once we know that Dr. Rieux is the narrator, Dr. Rieux resolved to compile this chronicle so that he should not be one of those who hold their peace, but should bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people, so that some memorial of the injustice and outrage done them might endure, and to state quite simply what we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. In the context of both COVID and World War II, somebody needs to remember, lest we all forget what we went through and the people we lost and the reasons that led us there. And I think it's two very distinct differences. One being a social malady, political malady, war-torn malady. One being, you could argue, another political malady, social malady, but from an organic, natural disaster. And yet, if we don't bear memorial or bear witness, then we will never be able to tell others that there is more to admire in others than there is to despise. That there is a reason to keep looking for the humanity in others. And it ends with, perhaps the day would come when, for the bane and enlightening of men, it would rouse up its rats again and send them forth to die in a happy city. And that is the perfect encapsulation, I think, of this book, that if they got nothing else out of a plague, it is for the enlightening of men. It is also their bane. It's such a perfect sentence to me, like knowing that in the future, humanity probably will have something like World War II or like a plague will happen again, because again, everything is cyclical. And for the bane, but both the enlightening of men, we can take out the best parts of us from the worst of times. I'm not as eloquent as Camus, which is why I did not write this book. And it's why he did crazy things when authors are like good at their jobs. I'm actually really glad I read this book, and it was super easy to get through. The beginning was a little bit confusing with a lot of people named, a lot of characters, a lot of, again, it's a third person narration, so don't really know who I'm supposed to care about. I don't really know where we are. But once the main characters were kind of established, it was much easier for me to follow and easy to digest, and truly just like beautiful prose. Like there is so much in here that I just highlighted because it's beautiful prose. And I also had this book from a secondhand bookstore, and there's definitely like some high schoolers annotations in here, which is hilarious because some of them are literally like, WTF? Love this paragraph. or like LOL me. And I just think that's so cute because though we are having very different reading experiences, I'm glad that this person got something out of it as well. And that is the beauty of humanity. Okay, I will see you in April when I think next for me is a sci-fi. But we'll see. Because maybe with spring coming, maybe it's time for a romance. We'll see where we go. Okay. See you next time.